Hi everyone, good morning or evening wherever you are. I'm Yarden. I'll be talking today about the Windows pool and how it changed since Windows 10 Redstone 5 and how that impacts us mostly from an exploit development or exploit defense perspective. So before I start, I'll just introduce myself as usual. I'm a software engineer at CrowdStrike. Before CrowdStrike, I worked at SentinelOne. I did security research and software testing. I'm also a circus artist doing aerial arts, and I used to be a pastry chef. And outside of my day job, I teach Windows internals classes with Alex Unesco at Winsiders. I blog and generally rant about Windows and security and stuff on Twitter or in a blog that's here on the slide if you're interested later. Okay, so to our topic, to anyone who isn't familiar, the Windows kernel pool is similar to the user mode heap. It's used for any kind of dynamic memory. Anything that needs to be allocated or modified during runtime is going to go in the kernel pool. Now, unlike user mode, where every process has its own heap, in the kernel, all the code running in the kernel is going to use the same pools. There are a few different kernel pools where the biggest difference is some are paged memory and some are non-paged memory, but there are a few other kinds as well, such as a special pool, etc. The pool is a pretty common and popular target for kernel exploits. For example, using buffer overflows to overwrite the next pool allocation or the one after that, to gain data corruption attacks, to use for data corruption attacks, and hopefully ultimately getting ring 0 code execution. And that's been going on for a lot of years. There have been all sorts of smaller mitigations around that, but as a technique, techniques using the kernel pool for exploitation are still relatively common as far as kernel exploits go. Now, the second thing that kernel pools are used for exploitation is information leaks. So because since ASLR, the addresses of drivers, the addresses of objects in the kernel are changing every boot, you can't predict them. So you can use the kernel pool. For example, if you have uninitialized memory there that's going to be returned to user mode, you get all sorts of random stuff that were in the kernel pool, random kernel pointers. You can get all sorts of fun information leaks there. Now, that has been mostly mitigated in Windows 10 with a new API, EXAllocate Pool 2, that zeroes out pool allocations once they're allocated. Then even if you have you don't have uninitialized memory anymore, you're not going to leak random pool data to user mode because it's all going to be zeros. But that new allocation API only mitigates one attack vector, and there are still many more. And if we look at the APIs that are exposed to third-party callers in the kernel, meaning kernel code that is not running inside the kernel itself, if we're just looking at the allocation APIs, we see at least 10 here. That's just the ones I got from IDA when I opened it up. That doesn't include any of the other APIs that handle the pool or any of the APIs running underneath them that aren't exported. And there are lots and lots and lots and lots of functions doing super complicated things. And in general, handling the kernel pool is a really complicated thing for the system to do, and just keeps getting more complicated the more memory the kernel uses. But from a developer or defender or exploit perspective, before RS5, the pool was a relatively simple thing because it had pretty simple structures as far as the exploit was concerned. We could look at the pool on a per-page basis. Every pool page started with a pool header that had some information about the block size, the previous block size, the type of pool it's in, and a pool tag used to identify the allocation. After each pool header, there was the data. After that, another pool header telling us information about the next block, its size, whether it's allocated or free, etc., etc. Data, another pool header, so on and so on. If we chose a random address in the pool, we could go to the beginning of the page, start parsing from the beginning of the page, and have all the information we needed about everything in that pool page. It was easy to parse. All the data was clear text. It was very easy to read. It was also very easy to fake if you used a buffer overflow vulnerability to override the next allocation. You could just, for example, fake the next allocation and tell the system that it's way smaller or way larger than it actually is, and get all sorts of nice techniques there. But that was before RS5. Since RS5, things look a little bit differently, and the structures of the pool look something like this, which is way, way, way more than just a single pool page. This is a little bit overwhelming. We'll go over some of it in this talk. And of course, not every exploit or defender will need to handle all of these structures, but a lot of them are relevant. We can't just look at a single page anymore, because with this new pool model, the system switches to a completely new design, which is the same as the design of the user mode heap. Now we're not looking at a per page view anymore. Single pages don't really mean that much in the modern kernel pool. Instead, we're looking at a model of segments and subsegments and all sorts of different things like that that require knowing the system a lot better just to figure out what we're looking at. But if anyone is familiar with the internal structures of the user mode heap, this will be very, very similar. It now uses the same libraries with minor differences to make it work properly for what the kernel needs. Which means you can now look at both user mode and kernel mode heaps in a very similar way, which is both good and bad, and we'll see later why. The one thing that hasn't changed is large pool. The large pool was managed by the VA space and still is. Nothing changed there, but we're not going to talk about the large pool today. Practically everything else is now different. One more thing that is different is that until RS5, we didn't really care all that much about the size of separate blocks. The main thing that we cared about when choosing where to allocate a single block is whether it's large enough to go in the large pool or not. If it's small enough to not go in the large pool, it went in the same regular pages, everything else. That's not true anymore. Now we do very much care about specific sizes of pool blocks, and later in this talk, we'll see why. Now, with this new model, every separate pool has one structure, one large structure managing it. That structure is the segment heap. That's allocated in the beginning of every pool. The first byte of the first page has the segment heap and all the structures contained in it. It has a lot of metadata information. For example, what address do allocations start in? What pages are committed? What pages are uncommitted? Amounts of allocated and free pages, all sorts of pointers to different structures that are needed to manage separate parts of the pool. And that's a structure that's good to know, and it has all sorts of interesting information when you're looking at an individual pool. Now, I mentioned that sizes do matter now more than they used to, and they matter in two different ways. The first one is, do they belong in the large pool? If they do, they go in the large pool as always. And if they don't belong in a large pool, we have a second split. Is the address over or under 508 kilobytes? Because if the address is over 508 kilobytes, it's a pretty, not the address, the size is over 508 kilobytes. It's a pretty large allocation, And we don't really need to look at small resolutions such as a single page. You can fit a whole lot of pages in 508 kilobytes, and there's no need to handle them on a per page basis because the system doesn't really care about the data inside the allocation. Instead, it can handle those, we won't call them large allocations because they're not a large pool, but let's call them big allocations. It can handle them with larger resolution in a way that's more efficient. Now, if the pool block is a small one, which is under 508 kilobytes, it can still be pretty small. It can be 20, 30, 40 bytes. Then we still need to handle it in smaller units of 1 page or less than a page and handle them sort of the same way we used to, but we'll see how that's still not exactly true. And now in the segment heap, we have 2 segments. The first segment, represented both by a heap Seg Context structure, is used for small allocations up to 508 kilobytes. And the second segment, or Seg Context, is used for allocations that are medium-sized, meaning 508 kilobytes, up to 8,128, which is the limit. Over it, everything is large pool. And each one of these Seg Contexts handles a different base unit. For small blocks, the base unit we're talking about is 1 page. For medium blocks in the second heap Seg Context, the base unit we'll talk about is 16 pages. So now instead of talking about pages, we're talking about basic units. But if we're looking at a single allocation, we do want to know what Seg Context it uses to know which structure we want to look at. So to know that, we have a new bitmap that it has 3 layers, like a lot of kernel bitmaps do. And for this bitmap, every allocation, every byte is represented by 2 bits. And if those 2 bits have a value of 0, this is a large pool. If the value is 1, it's a small pool block, meaning it's used in the first Seg Context for small blocks. And if the bitmap value is 2, it's a medium block, and we need to go to the second Seg Context to look at it. 3 is not really used. It has sort of inconsistent interpretation, but it's best to ignore it. Now, inside that heap Seg Context, again, we're talking about basic units of either 1 or 16 pages of basic information. And inside of each of them, we have a split into segments, where each segment handles a certain amount of memory. So in the first Seg Context, for small blocks, each segment handles 1 megabyte of memory. In the second, it handles 16 megabytes of memory. So they handle the same amount of units, but the unit size is different. And we can go to the Seg Context to iterate the list of segments and find each and every segment managed by the Seg Context. And if we want to parse them, handle them in whatever way we want. So this is just to reiterate, because there are a lot of new structures here. There's a lot of new data going on. So we have the segment heap in the beginning of the pool. That segment heap has 2 Seg Contexts for different sized allocations. And in each one of these Seg Contexts, we have a list of segments. And from those segments, we can get to the actual allocations. Now, how do we do that? The heap page segment structure is in the beginning of the segment, meaning for every pool block, if we go to the beginning of its segment, meaning either the beginning of the megabyte or the beginning of its 16 megabytes, we'll find the heap page segment structure. Now that structure has an array of 256 descriptors, and each descriptor represents a basic unit. And the descriptor in the descriptor array gives us information about the basic unit. What type of unit it is, and we'll talk about the different types of units later. Is it the beginning of a range, the middle of a range? Is it used, not used, etc.? And using the index of the descriptor, we can just multiply that by the size of a base unit, jump there, and get to the actual address in that range. And we'll see how we do that. Another thing that we have in the heap page segment, and we have that in this diagram, is we have a signature, and that signature can lead us back to the heap seg context. But go on to signature, because it's not a pointer. If you look at it, you'll see a value like the one on the slide that looks like complete garbage, because that's not a direct pointer to the seg context. It's an encoded pointer that's encoded with the segment address and a magic value that's hard-coded in the kernel, and a heap key. There are new keys now in the kernel that are, of course, non-exported and generated on boot that are used to encode all sorts of things. Because this design change in the pool, it was done mostly for performance reasons, but they also added some security improvements, such as encoding all sorts of interesting values to avoid info leaks, to make exploitation harder, to make it so that if you want to exploit the pool, you won't just need your initial vulnerability in your first primitive, you will also need a whole lot of information disclosures just to get the pointers you need. And this is one of them. So you don't have a direct pointer back to a heap seg context. You have an encoded one that you need to have all sorts of very specific information that's not even all that easy to get in the kernel to decode it. And we'll see that heap key being used in all sorts of other contexts later. And we talked about the descriptors and how the descriptors describe what type of unit this is, what kind of range this is. And now we need to talk about the second case, the second place where the pool block size matters. Because now we don't just care if the pool block is smaller or larger than 508 kilobytes. We also care if it's a common size or not. And when I say common size, I mean one of 129 common sizes that were hard-coded in the kernel, things like 10 bytes, 20 bytes, 30 bytes, 100 bytes, 200 bytes, sizes that we expect to see very often in the kernel. And for those sizes, we have one type of subsegment called LFH, or low fragmentation heap. Because if we have a lot of pool block size, let's say 20 bytes, then we don't necessarily need to have a header, like a pool header for each of them. We can just have a subsegment of only block size 20 hex bytes, right, one after the other. And then we don't really need a header for each. We just know that all the blocks here have the same size, and it's very easy to find them with simple arithmetic. And we can save a whole lot of space on headers that aren't really necessary. So for 129 common sizes, up to 4,000 hex bytes, we have LFH subsegments. Now, each type of LFH subsegment, each range of LFH subsegment will only have blocks of one of the 129 common sizes. So we could have one range that handles block size 20 bytes, one range that handles block size 40 bytes, another one that handles block size 100 bytes, etc., etc. And then we have the second type of subsegment, VS, or variable size, and that handles everything else. Anything that doesn't fit in one of the LFH buckets goes in a VS subsegment. Now, with a VS subsegment, we can't know in advance the size of all the subsegments because each one can have a different block size. So for those, we will have a header for every block. But in cases where we can save some space, we will use LFH and just know that all the blocks in this range have the same size. And here we can see what the ranges look like. Now in this slide, I made it so both ranges have the same size. And notice this is not always the case. We can have an LFH range that is 4 pages, and immediately after it, a VS range that is 11 pages. We can't know in advance the size of the different ranges, how many pages there will be. We will have ranges that cross page boundaries. The only way to know the size of a range is to go to the beginning of a segment and look at the descriptors, at the range descriptors, which will have information such as what type of range is this? Is it LFH? Is it VS? Is this unit in the beginning of a subsegment? Is it in the middle of a subsegment? What is the offset of this descriptor from the beginning of the subsegment, etc. You will really just need to go to the segment. If you pick a random page, you don't have a good way to know what type of subsegment it is or where it begins. So you just need to use the segment for that. Now, like I mentioned, LFH subsegments just have a header in the beginning of the subsegment, which is a heap LFH subsegment structure. And that has information about, most importantly, what block sizes are handled in the subsegment, what blocks are allocated, which ones are free, and all sorts of other metadata. For VS subsegments, we have a different structure that is, again, in the beginning of the subsegment. It's called a heap VS subsegment. And that gives us some metadata about the segment. But here we do need a header for every separate pool block because each one has a different size. So we have a heap VS chunk header for every pool block that has information about the block and, most importantly, its size. Now, anything that has explicit sizes is now going to be encoded. So this will be the LFH subsegment header and the heap VS chunk header. Both have size information, so both will be encoded. The VS headers will be encoded with the heap key, and the LFH subsegment will be encoded with the LFH key, which is another key also determined at boot, also saved in the kernel and not exported. Now, for every data block, it will start with a pool header, just for compatibility reasons and as a place to store the pool tag. But you can't use them to iterate the pool anymore or to parse it because only allocated blocks will have pool headers. For free blocks, you can't count on them having pool headers. It might be there because no one overrode it. It might be there as just junk information. But to iterate free blocks, you really need the actual structures used by the kernel to manage the pool. The pool header is just a nice thing to have there for compatibility for allocated blocks. It's a good place to find the pool tag, but not much else. Now, one way to find LFH and VS subsegments is to go to the beginning of the segment and walk the range descriptors one by one and figure out for every unit, is this an LFH or a VS subsegment? Another way is going to the heap, to the segment heap structure and looking there for VS and LFH contexts. These manage LFH and VS subsegments in the pool. They have linked lists of all the subsegments of that type, and they also have callbacks that point to management functions used for allocating, freeing, committing, etc. memory, because the kernel treats LFH and VS memory differently. This all just reiterates and gives a little bit more details about the specific encoding. Usually things are encoded with either the LFH or the heap key and the address of the header or the subsegment or wherever the structure is. This is just about the VS and LFH contexts. in the segment heap. Each of them has callbacks to kernel functions that are used to manage this type of memory. Now here we can see the LFH buckets. They are hard-coded in the kernel in an array. First, we have hops of 10 hex bytes from 0 to 200, or actually 400, then hops with larger resolution, and in total we have 129 sizes up until 4,000 hex bytes, meaning only Seg Context 0, the one that handles small allocations, has LFH subsegments. Anything larger than 4,000 hex bytes will always be VS subsegment, because these sizes are too large that we don't expect to have all that many of them. Another thing is, once in a while, you might also see one of these common sizes in VS subsegment. That's because we don't, the code won't activate LFH buckets until there are at least 16 allocations of that size. So the first 16 allocations of pool of block size 20 hex bytes will go in VS subsegments. Only after 16 allocations, the code will say, oh, okay, there are enough pool blocks of that size, will activate this LFH bucket, will create an LFH subsegment for block size 20 bytes. But you will still see a few blocks that were allocated before the bucket was activated, so you can still see them in VS blocks. And this just shows how these structures are connected, just zooming in on different parts of that huge, scary diagram from the beginning of the talk. Now, we've talked about the internal structures, or at least the part of them that is relevant for us in this case. Now, how does this affect exploitation? Mostly, this very much limits modern pool exploitation, because with this new design, spraying the pool is way, way, way harder, because we need to account for what type of subsegment this pool, this object that we're spraying is going to end up in. Is it a common size that will go in LFH subsegment? Is this a non-common size that will go in VS subsegments? If this is a VS subsegment, then every block has an encoded header. How do we handle that? Also, subsegments cross page boundaries, so we need to account for all sorts of things like weird alignments, because there are all sorts of weird alignments going on with this new model. Also, we don't necessarily know that all of our sprayed objects will necessarily end up in the same subsegment. Even if it's the same subsegment type, we can have 4 pages of LFH subsegment, then 9 pages of VS subsegment, then 5 pages of another LFH subsegment, but of a different size. We don't necessarily know that we'll have all of our sprayed objects immediately one after the other. We can't know that the pool block we're overflowing is not at the end of a subsegment and will overflow a different subsegment. If we're trying to use a buffer overflow, we will need to get a buffer overflow in a pool block that is the same size as the blocks we're spraying. Otherwise, they could end up in different subsegments. Even if they're both LFH sizes, they will end up in different LFH subsegments. If we're going to overflow a block in a VS subsegment, then we're going to overflow the next VS chunk header that isn't encoded. And if we don't fake it correctly, then when the kernel tries to handle it, it will decode it and will most likely just crash in one way or another. And faking it is really hard, because to encode it properly, we need like 2 or 3 different information disclosures that are very non-trivial anymore. So it doesn't make it impossible, but it doesn't make it a lot harder than this used to be. That's one thing. And we also have all the different mitigations that were added before this change, such as the new allocation API that zeroes out allocations once they're made, meaning it removes a lot of the information leaks that used to exist. And now when we need way more information leaks to, for example, encode and fake pool headers or decode pool headers if we can read them, that makes it even harder. Another thing is there used to be a lot of pool overflows, of buffer overflow techniques in the pool that took advantage of object headers and corrupting them. A lot of these things were mitigated too in the last few years, making this also a little bit harder. But it isn't all that bad, because there are still some benefits too. One of them, which is pretty cool and was discovered by Alex Ionescu when we initially researched the new pool design, is that one of the kernel pools that used to exist and now isn't used all that much anymore is the executable non-paged pool. Because up until Windows 8, or Windows 7, I think, the default non-paged pool was executable for all sorts of historical reasons. And since then, things changed. The default non-paged pool is now non-executable, non-paged pool NX, but the non-paged pool still exists, sort of. In most systems, it's not used anymore, but since the pool type still exists, there is still a segment heap for it. And because there is a segment heap for it, we need to have at least one page of executable non-paged pool to allocate the segment heap in. So if you know where to find it, there is still one read, write, execute page in the kernel. Now, yes, there is a segment heap structure there that you don't really want to corrupt, but that structure with all the different nested structures in it takes about half a page, around 800 hex bytes. That leaves you with about half a page of read, write, execute memory in the kernel, even if no one uses any regular non-paged pool memory at all. So that's a nice little place for your kernel shellcode if you have an arbitrary write vulnerability and manage to find that page. It's a nice place to drop your shellcode. Now, of course, that doesn't work with HVCI, because with HVCI, the executable non-paged pool doesn't exist anymore, but very, very, very few systems use HVCI, so that's still a pretty cool trick. And here is proof. I use this winback command to find the executable non-paged pool, dumped its PTE, and we can see that I actually have a page of read, write, execute memory on my system, which I think is very cool. Another thing is the secure pool, because now with Hyper-V, we have the secure kernel that is completely protected from normal kernel. Regular kernel code can't access it. And one of the things that we got there is the secure pool. It's a pool that is read-write in VTL1 in the secure kernel and read-only for normal kernel code. And its purpose is to let third-party drivers allocate memory that they don't want anyone to be able to overwrite to avoid data corruption attacks. And since all pools now use the same design, that means the secure pool uses that design too. And another thing that Alex discovered in that research is that the secure pool, it has a read-only mapping for the normal kernel to read. And that read-only mapping contained the whole pool, including the segment heap structure on the first page. And what we know about the segment heap is it has all sorts of pointers. And because it was a mapping of VTL1 that has a different address space that should not be exposed to the normal kernel, it should be ASLR'd. Having that structure mapped into VTL0, into the normal kernel, leaked all sorts of different addresses. And the most interesting ones were the callbacks in the VS and LFH contexts, because these callbacks point to kernel functions that are used to allocate free, etc., LFH and VS blocks. And for in the secure pool, these pointed to addresses of functions in the secure kernel that should not be available to normal kernel. Now, since Alex discovered and reported that this was fixed, the segment heap is not mapped into the normal kernel anymore, so you can't use that. But there are still a few address leaks there using other structures, such as the heap page segment that leaks the addresses of the secure pool itself and addresses of the metadata heap, where the segment heap is now allocated. So not as critical as leaking the address to the secure pool, but still some VTL1 to VTL0 address leaks that might be useful to someone at some point, and those aren't patched as of today. Now, before I finish the talk, I want to show a few interesting tools that you can use to analyze the pool. If you're using Windbag, you can use Bank Pool. It was broken for a while, now it's back. It works in about 98% of cases. Still a little bit slow, but it does work. I also wrote a pool extension that works similarly to Bank Pool. It's a lot faster and has a few other cool features that I'll release after the talk. And the coolest one is a GUI tool called Pool Viewer that I wrote that looks like this. I already loaded a dump in it of the current machine. I preloaded it because it's a little bit slow. And you can use it to view general data about your pools, what heaps you have, what types, how many blocks, some cool statistics like the common pool tags, including empty pool tag, and how many blocks you have of each type. Unsurprisingly, the most common one is LFH. And if you want, you can go to the second tab and view blocks individually. You can filter them based on whatever it is that you want to filter, and use that as the beginning, as either investigating your pool or looking into specific addresses, trying to find all sorts of weird or interesting information. It knows how to open an existing dump file, or if it's running as an admin, you can analyze your live machine, which just creates a dump of your current machine and opens it. Or you can export all your pool blocks to CSV and run whatever data analysis tools you have on them. So that's it for now. Of course, there is a lot more to do here. For example, there is a very, very, very cool research done by a few people from Synactive showing new exploitation techniques using this new pool design. There will be more research in the future, I hope, and there is a lot more to discover and do in this context. And for anything that you want, I'm available for questions here, on Twitter, on email, or on any platform where you manage to find me. So thank you for coming to my talk, and I hope you learned something about the Windows pool and exploiting it. Thank you.